There's a new podcast from the TED Audio Collective I'd love to tell you about. It's called Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter. Body Stuff reveals the lies we're told and sold about our health by exploring how the body actually works and some of the surprising backstories behind the health advice we're given. I mean, is it actually possible to boost your immune system? Do we really need 8 glasses of water a day? Find and follow Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter wherever you're listening to this. Hello there, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, the podcast series that starts where a TED Talk ends. Today, in this period dominated by COVID-19, there's a basic question that matters more than ever. What does it take to be a happy person? The science of happiness is full of surprises, actually. Our instincts about what will make us happy and the actions we take in pursuit of happiness often end up disappointing us. Our guest is Professor Elizabeth Dunn. She's been researching happiness for years and has a long list of delicious insights into what really creates it and the difference between fleeting pleasure and deeper, longer-lasting happiness. She gave a beautiful TED Talk last year.
So I have a pretty fun job, which is to figure out what makes people happy. It's so fun, it might almost seem a little frivolous, especially at a time where we're being confronted with some pretty depressing headlines. But it turns out that studying happiness might provide a key to solving some of the toughest problems we're facing.
Now, during that talk, Liz told a truly inspiring story about how her community of friends and neighbors found happiness together, and she gave a lovely update to that story in this interview. But first, let's start with some of her latest psychological research and how we can make use of it in our own lives, especially at this moment. So, Liz, welcome to the TED Interview.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I'm so excited about this conversation. We are going to spend the next hour talking about what is arguably the most important topic there is, happiness. Is there a more important topic?
I mean, this is why I've devoted my life to studying this topic, because for me, it's sort of the fundamental question that everything comes back to is what makes people happy.
And your research is so interesting to me. I mean, there's a lot of people in the positive psychology movement who've researched happiness in different ways. You've picked what feels almost like a very accessible, very viscerally right sort of approach of studying some of the core things that cause it, that are part of everyone's life, namely, if I have this right, like time, money, technology. So that's great because that gives us a structure for the conversation, actually. We're going to dive much more deeply into all three of those things. But I guess before we start, I should ask you, what is happiness even? People use the word in many different ways. How do you define it, Liz?
So I use the definition that is accepted by most scientists these days, which is that happiness really involves 3 components. Positive emotion, having a fair bit of joy and contentment on a typical day, not feeling too much negative emotion, so not feeling blue or frustrated or angry too frequently, and also feeling some satisfaction with your life. So when you take a more reflective stance and think about the conditions of your life, do you feel like you're living the kind of life that you want to have?
I mean, just on the emotional side, it feels like there's multiple things that kind of get lumped into or can get lumped into, happiness from sort of simple pleasures, right? Hey, I'm enjoying this ice cream. I feel happy about that. To, I guess, what you'd call like a much deeper feeling of happiness or inner peace or, I just, in this moment, I just feel calm and joyful and at one with the universe in some ways. Are all of those things connected? Are they just part of the same spectrum, or are they actually literally different things that we just happen to sometimes label the same way?
Well, what I love about the current scientific approach to happiness is that it's really value-free. So we try to measure a variety of positive emotions. So asking people, like, thinking about yesterday, did you experience joy? Did you experience contentment? Did you experience pleasure? And it could be that you lay around all day playing video games and eating ice cream. And you could tell me you felt awesome. And I'm fine with that. It's it's not about layering on sort of some value judgment about what should make you feel good. It's just about looking at what are the situations that actually produce these positive emotions. I think traditionally there's been this assumption that like meaning and happiness are fundamentally different and they're different pathways to the good life. And that's not what we see in our research. Instead, what we see is that meaning and happiness are very closely aligned, that people experience more positive emotions when they're doing the kinds of things that actually produce genuine fulfillment.
Because it seems like for a lot of people, maybe it's just guilt-prone people like myself, but on the same day, in the same hour, you can have lots of pleasure, which in one way would be like a positive emotion. I mean, you're sitting there in front of the computer distracted by some internet distraction and, it's sort of pleasurable or you wouldn't do it. And then at the end of it, you go, that was so unproductive. I hate myself. I'm so lazy. I can't make the right decision. Like, is there a clear sort of scientific process almost to differentiate between pleasure in the moment and this sort of reflective satisfaction?
Yeah, so in most of our research, we really try to capture both. So we try to look at both, how much joy and contentment you're experiencing in the moment, but also when you take that more reflective look at your life, do you feel like you're living the kind of life that you want to have? And both of those things matter. And there are certainly situations that can drive those apart, that can produce the positive emotion, but not make you feel like you're living the kind of life you want to have. But interestingly, in most of the work that I've done, we've discovered choices people can make in their lives that seem to promote both. So that seem to promote both, these positive feelings and that contribute to people's sense of living the life that they want to have.
So that would be the ideal scenario where those two things aren't in conflict. I mean, we've had Danny Kahneman on the podcast, and he distinguishes between the experiencing self and the remembering self. Does that connect to what you've just said, that those two selves arguably experience slightly different kinds of happiness, and it's important to measure them both and sort of keep the distinction clear. And in your case, try to find those activities that achieve both.
Yeah, so traditionally, researchers really began by, I think, taking the perspective of the remembering self. So asking people to reflect on their lives, engaging the remembering self, asking you, do you feel good about the life that you're living? And it was actually Danny Kahneman who helped really push the field to also consider the experiencing self. So now, partly because of his efforts, major worldwide surveys include questions about, did you laugh or smile yesterday? Which is this much more sort of minute aspect of our experience. But I think it's really important too. And you can get into fun debates about what matters more, the experiencing self or the remembering self. I think it's pretty fascinating. But what we tend to see in our work is that it's possible to satisfy both the experiencing self and the remembering self if you kind of play your cards right.
Just talk about just a little bit more about how those two things are measured. So one is a survey that just asks in general how you're doing. And those surveys have been asked for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, like consistently with the same questions around the world, and have shown that most people, as they report in most countries, report as being happy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really fascinating to keep in mind at a time where it's easy to sort of paint the, situation of humanity as being rather bleak, that in fact, when you look at individuals' responses to these happiness questions around the world, most people are reporting pretty high levels of satisfaction with their lives. So for all the things that are wrong in the world, people are kind of doing okay. They're saying that they feel like they're living the kinds of lives that they want to have. And we can measure that aspect of happiness really quickly. There's a scale called the Satisfaction with Life scale that just asks people about 5 questions, and we can capture pretty quickly how satisfied they feel with their lives. But that doesn't tap into this more emotional component of how much joy and pleasure and contentment you're experiencing just on an average Tuesday.
Isn't there a risk, though, that research is distorted a bit by the fact that people like to tell themselves good stories about their lives. I mean, maybe that's our protection to avoid us all going crazy. You spend the day in a lot of stress and fighting with stuff and whatever. But I mean, if someone asks you, how do you generally feel about your life? If you say, no, I'm miserable, then what's left? You kind of drive yourself to despair. Aren't we very good at telling a story to make ourselves feel happy almost?
I mean, it's certainly possible that people are inflating their answers upward a little bit, but I think it's really important to recognize that these questions have value in that people's responses to these kinds of questions about their life satisfaction are related to suicide rates. They are related within countries to the level of trust that people have in their neighbors. You see lower levels of life satisfaction in countries where there are high levels of corruption. So these really quick, seemingly subjective responses actually do map on to all of the stuff that we care about. So, I've been pleasantly surprised by how well these very simple questions perform in capturing something really important about the human experience.
And how much do those measurements vary country to country?
So life satisfaction levels vary pretty dramatically across countries. Sometimes there's skepticism about whether it's really possible to change human happiness because there's so many factors that sort of push us back to our kind of baseline level of well-being. But Ed Diener, who's one of the forefathers of happiness research, has argued that, this can't really be true. It can't be true that it's impossible to change people's happiness levels because of the dramatic differences that we see between countries. So, for example, people living in war-torn countries like Syria are just dramatically less happy than people living in, imperfect but basically pretty okay countries like Canada. So if you could pick one thing to sort of determine your happiness, like just getting to live in a nice, safe country where people trust their neighbors and, for the most part, there's some degree of safety net, like that makes it a really big difference for people's level of life satisfaction.
So, Canada, I mean, you're Canadian, right?
I'm originally American. I moved to Canada 15 years ago, and I now have 2 passports in my purse. But I am a very proud Canadian, as well as being originally American.
Okay. And you definitely seem, in all my interactions with you seem like a happy person. And certainly Canadians, can I say, have a reputation for being both happy and awfully nice. What is it about Canada?
Well, I don't want to speak for all of Canada, but, I would say one thing that I really value about Canada is that we do provide a genuine safety net for people. It's certainly not perfect, but we kind of make sure everyone's taken care of. And this, to me, was really salient when I was pregnant with my son, and I was getting this great prenatal care, and it just hit me that this care was available to basically everybody in Canada, just by virtue of, being a Canadian resident, you get access to all of this medical care, and it just takes away this level of worry. And I have this feeling of like we're all looking out for each other a little bit.
If Canadians are born in war-torn countries, are they happier than their fellow citizens, or are they basically dragged down by the circumstance?
Yeah, so when people move from, say, a war-torn country to a safe country like Canada, their happiness climbs pretty quickly and eventually basically matches the levels of, people who've lived all of their lives in Canada. It might not always get quite all the way there, but for the most part, it seems to be about where you live now rather than where you came from, to just paint with very broad brushes.
I mean, is there any research trying to test whether there's also a big genetic component there? I mean, if people naturally have different levels of sort of happiness affect, if you like, or to put it another way, it's easier for some people to be happier than others. Is that right? But that nonetheless, wherever you are on that spectrum, there are things that you can do that genuinely do make a difference to your happiness level.
Absolutely. And so there's a really powerful genetic component to happiness. But again, I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of body type, right? So some people are predisposed to have a heavier body type genetically, others to have a more athletic body type. But, we know that, but it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do and that your lifestyle is just irrelevant. So sometimes I think we mistake a strong genetic component for meaning that, oh, well, I'm just stuck with whatever I've got. So, it's worth recognizing happiness is going to come more easily to some people than others, but changing our happiness levels is something that I think is within everybody's reach.
That feels to me like that's such a powerful belief that you would want everyone on the planet to hold. Because without that belief, you won't take those actions.
Right. And I think it's important not just from an individual perspective, but when we think about policymakers, for example, getting involved in happiness research, right? If we could never improve anyone's happiness, well, then what's the point of good social policy, right? But in fact, there are these massive differences between countries in how happy that citizens are living there. And so what that tells us is, you know what? We can make a difference, not only for ourselves, but at the level of societies. We can change how happy people are, how much they're flourishing by altering social policy.
Okay, so you've done a bunch of interesting research on happiness. Talk to us about time and your research into how the way you use your time impacts your happiness.
Yeah, so I got really interested in the relationship between time and happiness as I started to get just super busy. And there's this really fascinating concept of time affluence. So we're used to thinking about financial affluence. Financial affluence matters. So richer people are happier than poorer people. But it turns out time affluence matters too. So feeling like you just have enough time to do the things that are important to you is pretty critical for happiness. And so for me, figuring out that puzzle has been a really interesting and ongoing quest.
So how did you research that?
Yeah, so one thing we started to do was to think about the trade-offs that people make between time on the one hand and money on the other. So my former student, Ashley Willens, and I developed this really simple question where we basically just ask people whether they tend to prioritize money or tend to prioritize time. And often, time and money are in conflict. So you can pay more to take a direct flight or save some money and, have to be sitting around an airport for 3 hours. We navigate all kinds of trade-offs around time and money on a typical day and in a typical year. And so we started just asking this question to thousands of people, both in North America and Europe. And what we found was that people who typically prioritize time over money are happier than people who prioritize money over time. Now, of course, what does that mean? How do you prioritize time over money? Well, one way to do it is to buy time, to actually use money to buy yourself time-saving services. And what we see is that remarkably, across the income spectrum, people who use money to buy themselves time are happier than those who don't, again, even after we control for income.
How many people with money actually use it to buy time? It feels anecdotally as if often what happens is that the more money people make, the more obsessed they get with making more money. And paradoxically, don't use the key resource they have that could actually buy them some happiness.
Exactly. And so, we've been kind of startled to see how rarely people think of buying themselves time as a route to happiness. So we've even studied millionaires in Europe, people who have a fair bit of disposable income, and about half of them report not spending any money in a typical month to buy themselves out of the sort of time-sucking tasks that they hate to do, that they could pay somebody else to do. They don't. And so I think this is a kind of an underutilized strategy, something that we have this, especially with the growth of the gig economy and so forth, we have this opportunity to rethink some of the trade-offs that we're making between time and money, potentially buy ourselves out of the things that we hate doing, that just thinking about them fills us with dread. And yet many of us aren't using our money in that way.
And then if I think about the implications for fundamental fairness, it feels to me like there are two contradictory arguments you can make. You could say that people who feel that modern life is really unfair because inequality is growing and some people have so much money and that's really not fair, that one argument would be, well, actually, when it comes to time, which is the more important question, there's actually much more equality. And if anything, rich people tend to spend even more time chasing down that rabbit hole. But the other way of thinking about it is, wait a sec, you're saying that time is really crucial for happiness and that money can buy time. And so it's doubly unfair that the rich get to buy themselves time and therefore happiness. How do you think about the sort of the equity implications of what you just said?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. I mean, so as people get wealthier, they tend to feel more pressed for time. And it turns out there's like a really basic reason for this, which is that when a resource is scarce, we tend to perceive it as being valuable. Similarly, when a resource is valuable, we tend to perceive it as scarce. So as our time becomes worth more money, we tend to feel like we don't have enough of it. Like our time has become so valuable that it's like this very scarce resource. So, I think it's just important to recognize that that relationship exists. At the same time, I think sometimes it's perhaps a false assumption that people especially at the really low end of the income distribution, I think they can get stuck with very real time burdens where they're spending hours trying to take the bus to get to multiple different jobs. And so experiencing that massive time suck. Actually, my former grad student, Ashley Willens, again, she's doing this really amazing work in Africa, trying to look at whether alleviating time poverty can actually be an important and I think overlooked way to help address this broader problem of poverty. So we focus on financial poverty, but time poverty can also be a really important source of misery for people at the really low end of the income distribution. And so I think addressing that for people who are suffering through poverty is super important. At the same time, I don't think we have to just scoff at wealthy people for experiencing stress. Like the stress that they are experiencing is real and genuinely experienced all the way across the income distribution. It's helpful to buy time.
So give a few more examples of that, of the kind of things that people really should pay more attention to and could consider doing, both with people maybe with a reasonable amount of money and people with less money.
Yeah, so I can give you an example from an experiment we ran in which we gave people $40 to spend on a time-saving service on one weekend. And they did things like having groceries delivered, having a cleaning service come. One woman paid this neighborhood boy, as she termed him, to go get something for her from the mall. And so, it was pretty diverse, right? People were using this money in a lot of different ways. But what we saw across the board was that on the day where people used money on this time-saving service, they ended up happier at the end of the day compared to this other weekend when those very same individuals spent $40 on a material purchase for themselves. So this suggests that whatever it is in your life that's sucking up your time, if you can buy your way out of it, again, it doesn't have to be with a massive amount of money, that this can make a measurable difference for your happiness.
Playing devil's advocate for a sec, did you check again like a year later? Because a year later, the memory of that weekend may have gone, but you've still got the shiny toy that you like to fiddle with.
Right. No, that's a great point. Right. So maybe people were just still filled with joy from that material thing. Although I would be skeptical of that because what other studies have shown is that in general, people's enjoyment of material purchases wears off pretty fast, actually faster than more experiential purchases. But I also would not suggest that paying for one time-saving service on one weekend is going to make you happy forever. Instead, I think it's about using these services to create a little bit of space for yourself at the times that you most need it. And again, one purchase is never going to make you happy forever. Happiness is not this destination we arrive at and we get to stay indefinitely. Instead, it's about changing our day-to-day and week-to-week habits.
Let's talk technology. How can your use of technology impact your happiness?
I've been really interested in this question ever since our social interactions kind of became permeated by technology. So in one recent survey, something like 95% of people reported using their smartphone during their most recent social gathering. As somebody who cares a lot about social connection and happiness, I got really curious about this. And so we just started running studies to look at the situations in which smartphones in particular can both undermine and support our well-being. In one study, we brought people into a restaurant. So we said, come have dinner at this local restaurant and we'll pick up the bill. So people came to dinner with, 4 or 5 friends or family members. And in half the groups, we said, hey, can you just put your phones away during the meal? We just kind of mentioned this in passing as a little housekeeping detail. In the other groups, we said, we're going to send you a survey halfway through the meal. So can you just make sure to have your phones out and available so you get that survey? And then we let people eat their meal. And then at the end, we just asked them a variety of questions about how much they enjoyed this experience of dining out with friends, how they felt during the meal. And what we see is that when people had their phones out and available during the meal, they end up enjoying it significantly less compared to people who had to put their phones away. And I think this is interesting because, it's not like people were spending all their time on their phones. They, on average, were touching their phones about 11% of the time during the meal if they had access to their phones. But this was enough to kind of chip away at their enjoyment in a way that we were able to detect. And what we see is that this seems to stem largely from just this little feeling of distraction, of not feeling like completely present in the moment, seems to partially undermine the benefits that we get from this very quintessential human experience of sharing a meal.
I mean, that's a really cool experiment. I think a lot of technologists, we're all aware of this phenomenon of so many people bringing smartphones to restaurants, and you look at this family and then none of them have eye contact with each other at all. They're just there on social media or whatever. But I think a lot of technologists, almost their first instinct would be to sort of whisper back, yeah, but, they're actually enjoying it more because, how much can a family say to each other? At the end of the day, they are connecting with the communities that they care about more. They're deeper friends who can't be present and da-da-da. What you're saying here is that, no, actually, the people with phones out themselves declared less happiness in the meal, even than those who were kind of, stuck with other boring, familiar friends and whatever. But we're focused on them. We're in the moment. That's really interesting.
Exactly. And so we actually expected that although people might enjoy the meal significantly less if they had access to their phones, we thought there would be an upside, which is that we thought if people had their phones, they might experience a bit less boredom. Because at least, I live in Canada, so when people start talking about hockey, I want to zone out. Like, I could turn to my phone and get through that little bit of boring part of the meal. But, to my surprise, we actually found an effect in the opposite direction, where people who had access to their phones actually reported higher levels of boredom. And again, that seems to stem from this slight bit of distraction. So where you're just not completely fully engaging. This study has changed my behavior. I have really tried to commit. I'm not perfect at this, but I've tried to commit to in important social situations where we're spending time with people we really care about, trying to put my phone away.
That's really interesting. We actually have a similar effect we've noticed at live TED conferences. I wonder whether there's almost like boredom is experienced in a second or two, but the opposite of boredom has to sort of unfolds over a longer time period. In other words, so if you think about a talk, you're listening to a talk, you can easily hear a few sentences that you're bored by. If your response to that is to pull out a phone and look at something else, that eases the boredom in the moment. But what happens is that you lose the context that actually makes the rest of the talk interesting. So you've just taken away from yourself the possibility that you'll ever really get absorbed and pulled in because you've sort of missed key moments in it. And I wonder whether there's something the same is almost happening in a group dynamic, that once you break the magic spell, even though in the moment it didn't feel that good. What it was actually doing was building context, and it takes a while for people to really connect with each other. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. We're running an experiment right now to try to get at that idea. We've turned our lab into a kind of rec room. So I purchased a foosball table and giant Jenga, and we've created the situation where people can just hang out in our lab. What we think is that it probably takes a little time for these effects to emerge. So, in that initial moment, it may feel sort of tempting to turn to your phone, and it might even be a little bit more interesting than whatever's going on in the moment. But that if you don't have that ability to sort of tune out to your immediate social situation, that over time, you kind of build this context and start engaging with the other people around you in a way that actually protects you from boredom.
I mean, this strikes me as really important. It's almost, it seems to be like another direct example where in the moment instinctive selves are kind of at war with our wiser, more reflective selves, our deeper selves, in a way I would almost frame it, and that we operate against our own instincts. Our immediate desire for distraction, whatever, literally fights our longer term, deeper satisfaction. And I almost wonder whether this should be the first topic we teach in schools. Is you are not just one person, one self. You've got to learn how to manage the selves that are in you. That's your number one job.
Right. And it doesn't take too long for the benefits of putting your phone away to emerge. So, even by the end of a dinner, people are reporting more enjoyment if they put their phones away. But they do have to engage in that sort of little bit of planning up front to look after themselves, because I think once our phones are out and available, we're faced with all of these little temptations that are hard to fight. And in the moment, each one is so tiny, so small that it doesn't feel like a big deal. And I think that's sort of the root of the problem.
So it seems like part of your research has been how to find the activities that sort of are win-win. You were telling me a couple of days ago about how you're trying to apply this especially to climate. You've been thinking a lot about the climate situation. Talk about that, about how you can use your learnings about happiness for sort of wise ways for people to respond to climate issues.
Yeah, so I think there's just so much fear and shame and guilt surrounding climate change right now. And those emotions have their place, right? Those emotions can be pretty powerful in changing behavior. And so for a while, as a happiness researcher, I kind of thought, all right, I don't really have much to say about this issue. But then I realized, happiness, what's great about happiness is that it's an approach emotion. It enables us to kind of tackle big challenges in new ways. So there's this idea that happiness helps to broaden our thought action repertoires, to sort of give us a new level of flexibility in how we might respond to a situation. And I think that's what we need when we're tackling this grand challenge of climate change, is a willingness to rethink our old habits. So with my colleague Jiaying Zhao, I've been thinking about what we call sweet spots, these behavioral changes that can both be helpful in reducing people's personal carbon footprint, but also increase individual happiness. So, and if we can find these, I think these are sort of the low-hanging fruit, the behavior changes that should be easier to stick with because they actually promote individuals' happiness as well as being good for the climate.
Can you give some examples?
So one example is commuting. Commuting is terrible for happiness. Basically, having a 1-hour commute versus almost no commute takes an equivalent toll on your happiness as becoming unemployed. Commuting is just tends to be among the least enjoyable activities of most people's day. And of course, long commutes, especially by car, are really problematic for our carbon footprints. So I think the climate crisis maybe provides us with an opportunity to reconsider some of our old habits. So if we've just gotten in the habit of having a long commute to work, I think the climate emergency can give us some space to go, okay, wait, maybe I should be doing this differently. Could I move closer to work, or could I carpool? So one of the things I've learned from my colleague Jiaying is that if you can just carpool with 2 other people, that will bring your commuting carbon footprint down to the same level as if you took commuter rail instead of driving. And so you can turn this unpleasant experience of driving to work by yourself into this much more positive experience of socializing through carpooling, but it takes some effort. You got to have the impetus to do this. And so I think the growing recognition of the need to change our behaviors in response to climate change can also provide this opportunity to rethink some of the behaviors that have been making us unhappy. Another example that I've been thinking a lot about lately is flying. So I fly quite a bit for work. Some of those trips are absolutely necessary, but others, they've just sort of become habitual. And flying is just terrible for your carbon footprint. So one round trip flight across the country is equivalent to, you'd have to give up driving for 3 months to offset that flight in terms of carbon. One thing I've been thinking about is, all right, we need a framework for thinking about whether flights are really worthwhile. I personally have found that flying a ton can cut into my sense of time affluence. So constantly packing my bags and racing to the airport does not make me feel like I have enough time to do the things in life that are important to me. Every time I am contemplating a flight now, I am just making myself stop and think and say, okay, given the carbon costs that this flight will have, what's going to be the impact on my feeling of time affluence? Am I going to feel a real sense of connection as a result of taking the flight? Because, an upside of flying is it can allow you to form relationships, allow you to spend time in person, which my research shows is really important for happiness. So I think what we need is sort of a framework or decision tree for figuring out, and this is going to be somewhat idiosyncratic, but figuring out, is this flight really necessary? Is it going to be good for my happiness now that I recognize just what a big impact each flight is going to have in terms of my carbon footprint?
To me, a really interesting research project, and maybe this has been done, is comparing the happiness equivalent of if you regularly connected with loved ones who are in a different country on video calls, which have started to get really, really good, versus seeing them in person. Obviously, there's lots that you can't do seeing someone, when they're just on a screen. But it's in some ways it's surprising to me how much you can get. You can laugh together, you can show love to each other, you can tell stories, you can. I just wonder whether there's more we could figure out about how to save time and possibly spend more time actually on personal connection, albeit virtual. Do you think that's part of the solution and actually quite a noble use of technology?
Yeah, so this is the very next research project that I want to do. Is I want to figure out, when is a video call enough? Because a video call, I think, really does have a lot of the sort of key elements that matter for social connection. At the same time, some of my research does show that, actually just being present with somebody else, where you're sitting face to face, really can make a big difference for people's feelings of connection and happiness. So surprisingly, as a social psychologist, I would sort of assume that my field would have figured out by now, what makes it so rewarding to be in a room with someone else. We don't know the answer to that. What I'd like to do is, and, I would invite anybody who has ideas about this, I'm all ears, really want to figure this out, is what are the key ingredients that make being present with somebody so rewarding? And then, can we harness those ingredients maybe and change certain elements of video calls to recreate or build back in some of those ingredients? And if not, can we at least recognize when it's going to be worthwhile? So if we can really identify the key factors that determine, when being in person will be better, then we can choose to take that flight in the right situations and the rest of the time stick with the video call.
So in your wonderful TED Talk, you focused on one specific use of money and also to some extent time, namely generosity and the, I guess, surprising but also I think very hopeful fact that there's a correlation that at one level generosity seems to drive happiness provided you do it right. Talk about that a bit? Remind us just some of the core findings there, and what still puzzles you almost about that whole space, that whole area.
Yeah. So, pretty early on in my career, I started trying to figure out how to use money in the happiest ways. It turns out that using money to benefit others is actually a really effective way to promote happiness overall. One thing that I've kind of discovered along the way is that it does really matter how exactly we do it. So we're especially likely to get joy from giving to others if we can really see the impact that our generosity is having, and if we have an opportunity to connect with the individuals or the communities that we're helping. I would argue that human beings have evolved to find joy in giving to others, but the sort of charitable giving opportunities that present themselves to us don't always map on very well to the sort of human psychology that evolved over time to support giving. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to rethink giving opportunities and to structure them in ways that really facilitate this sense of connection and this capacity to see the impact that we're having.
I mean, at one level, many charities have sort of latched onto this, and they know that the effective way to get people to give is to sort of, to put the soulful puppy or the suffering child powerfully in front of people. And that actually having people feel like they're helping one suffering child is often more powerful than having people think that they're helping 100 suffering children or 1 million. There's just no correlation between those numbers and that feeling of engagement. Is that basically part of what you mean when you say people need to feel like they're helping an individual?
I mean, I think that's the very low-level version of that. So, seeing one face of a child that maybe I'm helping could spark a little bit more of a feeling of connection or a little bit more sense of how I'm having an impact. But I think it's can ring a little hollow, doesn't always feel that genuine or impactful. And so where I think things are starting to move is to go, well, could we make that connection be real? So there are really creative charities out there now where you can see one that I like is Donors Choose, which enables you to fund a specific project that, say, a teacher at your old elementary school wants to get microscopes to enable her students to do this project that she's dreamed up. You could fund those microscopes, right? And so then you have this very concrete sense of how you're actually making a difference. And so that's an example where technology has enabled us to have a clearer window into how we're making a difference. But I think there's so much opportunity to go deeper.
Does time play a role here as well? If the difference between someone, say, funding a homeless shelter or someone going to that shelter and spending some personal volunteering time and funding it, are those different levels of drivers of personal happiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think devoting some time to a cause that you care about can give you a window into how you're making a difference. Although, this is a real puzzle to me, but we haven't been able to detect as much of a positive relationship between volunteering and happiness as we have between giving money and happiness. If anyone out there has an idea of why that is, I'd love to figure this out. But we've literally published papers where we've published null results saying, okay, we went looking for this relationship between volunteering and happiness and we can't find it. So whereas this relationship between giving money and happiness, we get a lot more consistently.
I mean, one response I suspect some people listening may have is, it's obvious volunteering is hard. Why would we think it would make someone happy to go and, spend hard work, stressful work, actually getting close to people who are suffering and the discomfort that can, come with that. Some might even go further and say, I don't want it to create happiness. This is a gift of time. This is meant to be sacrificial, and don't cheapen it by saying I'm doing it to make myself happy.
Yeah, so I would argue that finding joy in giving is awesome. Like, I don't think we should be looking down our noses at people who say, hey, I found this volunteering opportunity that really does make me happy, or like I give to charity and it fills me with joy. Like, human evolution has left us with a lot of problematic features. But one of the really great features that we've gotten is that we as a species seem to be capable of finding very genuine joy in helping others. And so I would argue, rather than fighting against that or thinking, well, gosh, I found this giving experience enjoyable, so nobody should applaud me morally because it was pleasurable for me. I think, no, like, let's harness this, right? Like, let's build giving opportunities that really are joyful, because if we can do that, right? Like, if we can make giving be as pleasurable as going out to dinner with friends or something, it's going to be a behavior that people want to engage in. And again, we have this wonderful evolutionary heritage of finding joy in giving that I think provides a beautiful opportunity to deal with some of the really tough problems that we're facing.
Yeah. I mean, I think I fundamentally deeply agree with that the world has enough problems. We need every tool in the toolkit to persuade people to be generous and to spend more, to think about it more. And it's actually a riddle to me that on the one hand, you say evolution has created this wonderful side effect that being generous makes you happy. I mean, what a surprising thing for evolution and all its selfish genes to throw out there, that actually, if you can make people feel happy by doing good, then that is going to help create this cooperative species that can dream big and do amazing things together. So that's true on the one hand, and yet people don't know it, or people don't seem to instinctively know it often. You just said that people buy stuff and then within a short period of time they no longer feel satisfied with it. They don't give as much as they might and don't benefit the joy that they could have got from that. How did evolution screw up so badly to drive us to act for the stuff that actually doesn't give long-term satisfaction and to shun the stuff that does?
This is why people like me who research happiness have jobs, because it isn't completely easy to figure this out on your own, right? So, one experience makes you happy. You go, what do you take away from that, right? Should you do exactly the same thing again? Like, how do you generalize from it? So, and I would argue that on one level, people do recognize that helping others feels good. So, when we ask people, do you think that spending money on others would make you happy? The majority of them say, yeah, they endorse this idea. It's just that when you hand them $20 and say, okay, would you rather spend this right now on yourself or somebody else? That's where they say, gosh, there's this like sweater I really have been eyeing, or, this other thing I'd like to have. So I think at a higher level, like, people do embrace this idea. And, I've even gotten letters from people saying, why did you as a scientist need to tell us this? Like, this is in the Bible. It's not a new idea. The challenge comes in, like, the 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. Like, how are you going to spend your money right now? And so that's why, I've gotten really interested in thinking about, like, how can I be with people at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday when they're standing in line thinking about whether to spend a bunch of money on shoes or just a giant frappuccino or whatever it is. Can we reshape people's decisions in the moment? Because that's where I think the error creeps in, not so much at this sort of higher level.
Just going back to the riddle over volunteering, Liz, I wonder whether how the question is asked plays a huge role here. Like, I could picture someone, X hours after they've done volunteering, if they're asked, how happy are you? They might have been shocked, exhausted, appalled by what they saw or whatever, and might, not reply that high on the scale. If you ask them other questions like, are you proud of what you did this week? You might get a spectacular difference in response. Like, how much have you tried varying the actual question that you ask? Because I would guess that overall, that being proud of what you have done this week longer term is quite well correlated with a sort of sense of inner peace and life satisfaction at some level. But in the moment, it's bloody hard.
Right. And it's worth noting that people who regularly volunteer do tend to report higher levels of happiness than those who don't. But it's tricky because happier people tend to be drawn to volunteering. So what we've tried to do, and what we tend to do in a lot of our research, is to try to take an experimental approach. With volunteering, it's tricky because, like, if you're assigned to volunteer, it's no longer really volunteering. So we took advantage of this kind of natural experiment where students at a university in Boston were randomly assigned to either a regular course or a course that involved volunteering. And I'm telling you, we asked them like every question we could think of because this was such a special research opportunity. So we asked like every which way about their feelings. We looked at health measures. We found just so much nothing, like just no effects. So, I've been disappointed by volunteering. I want to see these benefits. And we so far we haven't found them. It doesn't mean they're not there. We just haven't succeeded in finding them.
It's like, come on, humanity, what's wrong with you?
Yes. Are
there any other elements that can impact whether generosity actually works and leads to happiness?
Yeah. So, another variable that I think is really important to consider is choice. So as with everything, choice matters. There's almost no better way to suck the joy out of giving than to make people feel like they've been forced to give. And I think this is a really interesting issue because on the one hand, if you care about a cause, it can be a great idea to ask your friends and family to give. At the same time, you never want to make people feel like they've been backed into a corner and forced to give. So, for example, in one study, people felt happier on days where they did something to help somebody else. But that effect was eliminated when people felt like they had been forced to do so, like they had had no other choice. So I think it's really critical to consider how to propel people to give while also giving them this, feeling of volition about whether or not they actually do so or how exactly they give.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's definitely a tendency, if you're passionate about a cause, to keep banging on about it, to guilt someone out, basically. And what I'm hearing is if you do that, you might get a one response, but the experience will be miserable enough for the giver that they won't come back.
Exactly.
Probably counterproductive. I mean, in your TED Talk, Liz, you gave this wonderful story of an example of your own volunteering where you participated in this program with other families to welcome a family of Syrian immigrants to Canada and sort of put this support system around them. That was hard work, expensive, and all the rest of it. I mean, do you feel happy that you did that? Do you think that contributed to your happiness? My survey of N=1.
Absolutely. And I think this is a program that could have been designed by happiness researchers because it just has all of the ingredients that really make giving feel good. So, at one end of the spectrum, you have writing a check to, say, UNHCR, which is a great charity. I've given money to them. But you just have this vague sense that your money might make a difference for somebody somewhere at some point. Whereas with this program, first we had to raise about $40,000 to support the family for their first year in Canada. And then there was a whole bunch of waiting that happened. But then, eventually, I got to go with all of my friends and meet this family at the airport. And I will never, ever forget the moment that they walked through those doors and we saw this family that we had been working toward helping for over a year at that point. And they are still a fundamental part of my life these days. And, my son, who's now 7, has had the chance to grow up with them over the past couple of years. And just seeing them flourish here in Canada has been literally one of the most amazing and wonderful experiences of my life.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounded, I won't say almost too good to be true in the TED Talk. You had the lovely image of teaching one of the kids to ride a bike, and so the updated story is that the family is flourishing.
They're doing well. Yeah. When I went to visit them over the holidays, the father of the family was out delivering packages for Amazon. So he had gotten a job. And the little boy who learned to ride the bike in the video, he has started kindergarten and has actually been identified as gifted. His English is beautiful. You would never know that he hadn't been born in Canada. Of course, there are challenges. It's hard for the family sometimes to be in this culture that is so different from where they came from. But there's just sort of like wonderful things in just the very mundane daily experience. So, for example, the oldest son in the family, the first thing he said when he arrived was, "I want to be on a soccer team." And so he's playing soccer and I see him in his cleats just looking so happy. And this was such a team effort. There were a lot of hard parts, a lot of waiting. But even when I'm having kind of a rough day or I get a paper rejected from a scientific journal, I think, you know what? It's all right. At least we did this.
Yeah. Liz, what would you say to someone who said, oh, all this talk of focusing on happiness, life, that's actually shouldn't be our goal in life. That's self-serving, selfish. We should be trying to, do a better job for each other, for the world, sacrifice, whatever. Does anyone ever put that to you and claim that you're only encouraging people to be more kind of narcissistic, self-indulgent, focused on their own feelings? What would you say?
I would say it's a false opposition because, as my research has demonstrated, what actually makes humans happy are pretty positive behaviors, right? So people are actually happier when they are spending money on others rather than just looking out for themselves. I think if we just sort of try to chase happiness without any idea of how to do it, I think that could be unproductive. But I think if we actually look to some of the latest findings in behavioral science, what we can see is actually really very good positive guidance about the kinds of behaviors that can actually promote happiness. And it just blessedly turns out that the behaviors that make us happy are also behaviors that are really good for the world.
So there's this phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. From what you're saying, it almost seems like that could be a dangerous phrase, that happiness pursued directly, that's not advice you want to give someone. The advice you want to give them is to pursue these other things that you've been talking about. Pursue social connection, pursue generosity, a better use of time. And if you do that, maybe one day happiness will kind of tap you on the shoulder and whisper, "Hey, I'm here."
I think that's right. So, if we just tell people to pursue happiness, that can kind of leave them flailing a little bit and not knowing how to get there. And I think the much more productive strategy is, for us as researchers, for example, to try to figure out, well, what are the conditions that actually foster happiness, and then advise people to, engage in the kinds of behaviors like generosity that actually promote happiness, rather than just saying like, "Hey, go be happy." That's kind of telling people, "Hey, go lose weight," but not telling them anything about how to do it. And what we know is that getting to happiness isn't necessarily the most intuitively obvious thing for people. And so I think we need to provide some support in helping them get there.
Tell me just a little bit as we get to the end here about your own happiness journey. I mean, are you happy, Liz? And has your research impacted your happiness?
I think most people would describe me as a very happy person. But, I wouldn't say that I'm in a great mood every single day. And I think, that points to a misconception that many people have about happiness, where they think that, happy people have to be like cheerful and chipper all the time. And the reality is, very few people are just constantly over the moon. And rather, happiness is about, each day when you wake up, finding some things that you care about that you're going to do that day, making space to spend time with others that you care about recognizing when something isn't going well and thinking about changing it. So I've definitely had plenty of moments in my own life where I just realized, gosh, I'm not doing this right. As a happiness researcher, I especially feel like if I can't do this, who can? So when I notice that I'm doing something, I'm living my life in a way that isn't making me happy, I try to just stop and think, okay, how can I change this? Or like, what studies do I need to run to figure out how to do this better? The work that I've done, I think it's fair to call it me search, in that, the research that I've conducted is often really spurred by just my own curiosity about how I can live my life better and live in a happier way.
And it has actually persuaded you to do that? And you think it has actually, therefore, improved your happiness level?
I would say that I definitely try to use the insights from my research in my own life. So, for example, my work showing that buying time-saving services promotes happiness. I was already kind of a believer in that before I conducted this research, but it did help me win like an ongoing fight with my husband about whether it was worthwhile to pay for a cleaning service. And I've now like definitively won this battle, I think. So when we published, a whole series of studies showing the benefits, he's like, all right, fine. You win this round.
So you're happier. Hopefully he's not symmetrically less happy, but...
No, because that's the fascinating thing about this. I mean, this is what we're seeing in this new data, is that it doesn't matter if you believe these principles. They still work for you. So, just to give one quick example, in this data set with 14,000 people, we asked them, do you think that donating to charity makes you happier? And so, most people say yes, some people say no. But even when we look at the people who say no, even within that group, those who give money to charity are happier than those who don't. So it's like you don't have to believe this. It's still probably going to work for you.
Give us a final, like if there's an idea you could share with everyone here to take away, what would that be?
I think I would say that, money, time, technology, these are all amazing resources that provide us with opportunities for happiness. But these are opportunities that many people squander, and that we can do a lot better. So we shouldn't expect just having money, for example, to make us happy. Instead, we really need to think more carefully about how we're using it.
Professor Elizabeth Dunn, that was amazing. You've given us all a fantastic gift there. I am going to try and use some of this wisdom and have a happier week ahead. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Happiness researcher Elizabeth Dunn. Do check out her TED Talk. It's called Helping Others Makes Us Happier. You can find it at TED.com. And we'd really love to hear from you, actually. Tell us what you think of the show by rating and reviewing us in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Those reviews are influential. We certainly read everyone and truly appreciate your feedback. This week's show was produced by Dan O'Donnell at Transmitter Media. Our production manager is Roxanne Hylash. Our show is mixed by David Herman. Our theme music by Alison Leighton Brown. Special thanks to my colleagues Michelle Quint and Grace Rubenstein. Thanks so much for listening to the TED interview. Stay safe. See you next time.
PRX.